Chapter 1. The letter from Elderwick Hall was a Tuesday of no particular note when the letter arrived. A grey morning had settled over London, the sort that draped itself over the city like an old shawl. I had just poured Hercule Poirot his second cup of chocolate when I noticed the envelope lying unopened beside his breakfast tray. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he gave it a curious glance, then a second, longer one. "This," he said, "is no ordinary correspondence, mon ami." I leaned forward, intrigued. The envelope was pale grey, with thick, expensive paper. No return address, only the name, scrawled in an ink that had bled ever so slightly around the edges. Hercule Poirot, London to Poirot, opened it with a letter knife, his movements careful, precise. The contents, once unfolded, revealed 3 short lines. Elderwick Hall is no longer silent. She speaks again, of what she should not know. Come at once, or another will die. There was no signature, only the date, yesterday, and a faint symbol at the bottom right corner, like a pressed wax seal, though no wax had been used. A circle, intersected by a jagged line. I felt a chill creep into the room. Poirot sat still for a moment, reading and rereading the words. Then he looked up, his expression unreadable. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "A melodramatic hoax, perhaps," he replied, "or a mind fraying at the edges of its own guilt." He tapped the page lightly. "But what interests me most is not the threat. It is this phrase, 'She speaks again.' Not cries, not weeps, not haunts. Speaks. You believe it refers to a ghost?" He raised an eyebrow. "I believe someone wants me to think it does. But ghosts, my dear Hastings, rarely send handwritten invitations." He stood and crossed to the bookcase, retrieving a thin volume from the top shelf. Within moments, he had turned to a page and held it up to me. A photograph stared back, sepia and worn with age. "Elderwick Hall," he said, "an estate in Suffolk. 20 years ago, a scandal involving a missing maid named Elsie Pharaoh. Her body was never found." I frowned. "You think this is connected?" "I think someone is very much hoping I will." A soft knock interrupted our discussion. Georges, Poirot's valet, entered with the morning newspaper. Poirot accepted it absently but paused before setting it aside. There, on page 5, was a small article buried beneath shipping timetables and parliamentary squabbles. "Elderwick landowner claims maid's ghost spoke his name. Lord Asquith Deverell, reclusive owner of Elderwick Hall, has claimed that the spirit of a long-dead servant has returned. Locals report seeing strange lights and hearing unexplained sounds. The manor, long thought to be cursed, has remained largely empty save for Lord Deverell and a small household staff." Poirot closed the paper slowly. "Voilà," he said. "A man with guilt, fear, or perhaps both. And a mystery whispered through the walls of a crumbling estate." I tried to conceal my unease. "You mean to go?" "But of course," he said with a gleam in his eye. "A ghost who knows too much. That, mon ami, is something even Hercule Poirot cannot resist." Chapter 2. The Man Who Feared a Ghost. Arrived at Elderwick Hall late in the afternoon, when the sun cast long shadows over the sprawling grounds, and the air was thick with a foreboding stillness. The estate stood isolated at the edge of a small village, surrounded by ancient oaks and a weathered stone wall. To call it rambling would be an understatement. It was the kind of place where secrets festered in the dust, and the wind seemed to whisper through cracked windows. Lord Asquith Deverell was waiting for us in the drawing-room. He did not strike me as a man accustomed to visitors. His posture was rigid, and his expression betrayed a mix of irritation and wariness. Deverell was a tall, gaunt figure, his clothes neat but worn, as though he had been wearing them for years without care. His face was sharply angular, his features carved in a way that made him appear perpetually anxious. Poirot, ever the master of introductions, extended his hand. "Lord Deverell," he said, his voice calm and collected, "it is a pleasure." "I trust we have not arrived too early." Deverell, after a long moment, took the offered hand. "Not at all, Monsieur Poirot. I was expecting you. Please, have a seat." We sat, and the silence that followed was oppressive. Lord Deverell's eyes darted nervously to the large windows overlooking the darkening garden. Poirot, who rarely missed a thing, was quick to notice the unease in his host's demeanour. His gaze never wavered, calm and focused. "I assume," Poirot began, "that you have summoned me regarding the disturbances you've been experiencing." Deverell's hands trembled as he reached for his drink. He did not answer immediately, as if weighing his words carefully. When he did speak, it was in a low, almost hushed tone. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with fear. "I've seen her. The maid, Elsie, in the hallways, in the garden. It is not possible, but it is happening. She speaks my name, Poirot, as though she knows all that I've done." I noticed Poirot's brow furrow slightly, though his face remained a mask of calm. "Tell me, Lord Deverell," Poirot said, leaning forward, "when did you first hear her?" Deverell swallowed hard, his eyes distant. "It began 6 months ago. At first it was just whispers, soft like the wind. But then one night I was in my study and I heard her voice, clear as day, calling me by name. I thought I was losing my mind, but then she appeared in the hallway. A shadow, a figure. It was her, Poirot. I could feel her, and since then she has appeared more often." "And you believe this is the ghost of Elsie Pharaoh?" Deverell nodded, his face pale. "She died in this house, Poirot. Disappeared years ago. But now she is back. I know it sounds insane, but I cannot ignore it." Poirot's gaze never left the troubled man. "You have had guests, yes? Friends, perhaps? Anyone else who has witnessed this apparition?" Deverell's eyes hardened for a moment, and I could see the struggle inside him. "No one else has seen her, at least not yet." His voice faltered. "I am afraid, Poirot, terribly afraid. I believe she wants something from me." Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling together. "What does she want, Lord Deverell?" he asked, his tone measured but probing. Deverell looked down at his hands, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the chair. "I don't know, but I suspect that the ghost knows something I've been trying to forget." There was a long silence. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Poirot finally broke the quiet. "We shall investigate this matter thoroughly, Lord Deverell," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "But I must caution you, ghosts are often the least of our concerns. It is usually the living, rather than the dead, who present the true danger." Chapter 3. Voices Through the Wall. The following day, Poirot and I took a brief tour of the estate. Elderwick Hall was a sprawling mansion with grand rooms filled with dusty furniture and portraits of long-dead Deverells staring down at us from every corner. The manor was magnificent, yes, but the air was heavy with neglect, as though the walls themselves had been waiting for something or someone to come and stir the past. Poirot, ever meticulous, took notes on every detail. The arrangement of furniture in the parlour, the ancient clock that had been stopped for years, and curiously, the faint scent of perfume that lingered in the drawing-room, as though it belonged to a long-forgotten guest. He examined every corner, every crevice, as though seeking some hidden clue. Lord Deverell had assured us that he had locked the door to the servants' wing, where Elsie Pharaoh had once lived. Yet, as Poirot passed by it, his eyes lingered on the old wooden door, almost as if it too had a story to tell. That evening, after a light supper, we retired to our rooms. I was still pondering the strange atmosphere of Elderwick Hall when I heard it, a faint sound that sliced through the silence of the night. It was distant, muffled, yet unmistakable. The sound of soft, indistinct voices, as though coming from the walls themselves. I rose from my bed and, curious, stepped into the corridor. The sound grew clearer. It seemed to emanate from behind the walls, near Lord Deverell's study, in fact, where the ghostly sightings had started. I walked softly down the hallway, careful not to disturb the silence. As I approached the study, I saw Poirot standing in front of the door, his head tilted slightly to one side, listening intently. His expression was one of quiet concentration. "Din, you hear it, mon ami?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded. "It's coming from inside the wall." Poirot's gaze shifted toward the door, then back to me. "This is most unusual, Hastings. You understand, yes? Ghosts, they do not speak through the walls. But perhaps it is not the dead who are speaking at all." He turned to me, his eyes sharp, with the gleam of a fresh insight. "We must investigate further. We cannot leave it to chance or superstition." With careful precision, Poirot produced his tools, his magnifying glass, his small notebook, and began to examine the door. I watched as he scrutinized the hinges and the frame, all the while listening to the soft murmurs that seemed to be growing louder, more urgent. It was as though someone, or something, was trying to convey a message, but it was trapped within the walls of Elderwick Hall. Poirot paused, his brow furrowing. He bent down, placing his ear to the door. For a moment, I thought he would speak, but instead he simply gestured for me to remain silent. He was listening more intently than I had ever seen him. Then, with a soft exhale, Poirot stood up straight, his expression inscrutable. "This is no ghost," he said quietly, "but something far more dangerous. I believe someone is hiding in the walls of this house, listening, waiting. The question is, who?" Chapter 4. The Maid Who Vanished Twice. The discovery that someone was hiding within the walls of Elderwick Hall added a layer of unease to the already charged atmosphere. Yet, despite Poirot's steady resolve, I could see that something weighed heavily on his mind. He had always been a master of observing the smallest details, but now there was a deeper focus in his eyes, a quiet intensity that suggested a puzzle he had yet to solve. After a restless night, Poirot and I met with Lord Deverell early the next morning in the drawing-room. The morning light slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the room. Despite the beauty of the landscape outside, the sense of foreboding had not lifted. "Lord Deverell," Poirot began, his voice calm yet probing, "I wish to hear more about Elsie Pharaoh, the maid who disappeared, as you said." Deverell stiffened, his face growing pale. He had clearly not expected such a direct inquiry. I've told you all there is to know," he stammered, his eyes darting to the window. "She vanished one night without a trace. I never saw her again. It's been 20 years. Poirot did not flinch. "Tell me about her disappearance. Was it sudden? Was she well liked by the other servants?" Deverell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. She was quiet, not a troublemaker. She had been with us for several years. One evening she simply had vanished. Gone. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. I thought perhaps she had run away, but there were no signs of a struggle, and no one has ever found her. I noticed how his hands gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles turning white. There was a nervous tension to his words. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "And the ghost?" Poirot pressed, his gaze unrelenting. "You believe she is the same girl, Elsie Pharaoh?" Deverell's voice dropped. "I don't know. It's absurd, isn't it? But I've seen her, Poirot. I've seen her. She's real, I tell you." Poirot nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And this disappearance, you are certain there was no one else involved? No one who might have had a reason to make her vanish?" Deverell hesitated, his gaze shifting to the side. No. No one, except perhaps my late brother." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his curiosity piqued. "Your brother?" "Yes," Deverell murmured. He had a history of strange behaviour. But it's nothing more than gossip, I assure you. He was always secretive, and there were rumours that he had a fondness for Elsie. But none of that is important now. She's gone, and we've moved on." Poirot's voice softened, but his words carried weight. "And yet, Lord Deverell, the past is never truly gone, is it? It lingers like the shadow of a long-forgotten crime." Deverell's face paled, but he did not respond. Poirot rose from his chair, his gaze never leaving the lord's tense form. "Mon ami," Poirot said to me, "I believe we have been given only half the story, and I suspect that the missing maid, Elsie Pharaoh, holds the key to what is happening here. But to understand her disappearance, we must first look at what was happening at the house before she vanished." Poirot turned to Lord Deverell. "You shall take me to the place where she slept, yes?" Deverell's face flushed, and he stood abruptly. "It's not necessary," he said quickly. But Poirot's unwavering gaze forced him to relent. "Very well," Deverell muttered, his voice tinged with reluctance. "I will show you." Chapter 5. A Séance and a Scream. The evening of the séance arrived with a certain inevitability. The air was thick with tension, and the gathering of guests seemed more like a collection of people pulled into a vortex of strange events, rather than a social occasion. The candlelit room where the séance was to take place felt almost otherworldly, its dark walls lined with antique mirrors, the heavy scent of incense lingering in the air. Lord Deverell had invited several guests to witness the event. each of whom had been deeply intrigued by the recent happenings at Elderwick Hall. I observed them closely as we settled into our seats around the table. A mixture of the curious and the apprehensive Poirot, of course, remained unaffected by the atmosphere. His small moustache twitched as he studied the faces around him, his eyes glinting with quiet intelligence. I, on the other hand, was more unsettled than I cared to admit, especially with the heavy curtains drawn tight against the windows, leaving us in a cavernous, dimly lit room. The medium, Madame Sybil, was an imposing woman dressed in a flowing black gown. She sat at the head of the table, her hands resting on the surface, her eyes closed in concentration. The guests watched her with bated breath, but Poirot's attention was not on her. His eyes were darting around the room, scanning the shadows and the faces of the other guests. As the séance began, a heavy silence fell. Madame Sybil muttered softly to herself, her hands hovering above the table. Slowly the room seemed to grow colder, and the candles flickered in a dance of their own. "Elsie Pharaoh," the medium intoned. "Elsie, are you here with us?" There was a long pause, the tension palpable. The air felt thick as though the room itself were holding its breath. And then it happened. A sharp, guttural scream cut through the silence, a scream so chilling that it seemed to freeze the blood in my veins. It came from across the room, from one of the guests, Miss Clarissa Waverley, a young woman with an air of fragile composure. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling as she pointed towards the far corner of the room. "She's here," she gasped, her voice shaky. "I saw her, Elsie Pharaoh." The room erupted in chaos. The candles flickered wildly, casting shadows that seemed to twist and stretch in unnatural ways. Madame Sybil gasped, her eyes wide with shock. The guests exchanged frantic glances, some backing away from the table in fear. Poirot remained remarkably calm throughout the commotion. He raised a hand, calling for quiet. "Madame Sybil," he said, his voice carrying authority, "you claim to contact the spirit of Elsie Pharaoh, yes? Then tell me, why, when Miss Waverley pointed to the corner, did you not turn your head? Was the ghost not in your line of sight?" The medium stiffened, her hands trembling slightly. I do not understand, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's sharp eyes remained focused on her. "I believe you saw nothing, madame. This was a well-executed illusion, a trick played to cause fear." Madame Sybil recoiled at the accusation, but Poirot's voice was unwavering. "Miss Waverley, you were not screaming out of fear, but out of suggestion. You saw what you were meant to see, but not the truth." The room fell silent as Poirot's words sank in. Miss Waverley's face reddened, and she lowered her hands, no longer pointing at the empty corner. Poirot turned to Lord Deverell, his gaze cutting through the man's evident distress. "I do not believe in ghosts," Poirot said calmly, "but I do believe in deception. And I suspect that someone is using the spectre of Elsie Pharaoh to conceal something far more sinister." Lord Deverell's voice quivered. "What are you saying, Poirot? Are you implying that someone is orchestrating all of this? That my fear is based on nothing?" Poirot's eyes softened, but his words remained firm. "Your fear is real, Lord Deverell, but it is not caused by a ghost. It is caused by a living person, someone who knows more about Elsie Pharaoh than they are willing to admit." At that moment, the door to the room creaked open, and a servant appeared in the doorway, looking anxious. "My lord," the servant said, "there has been a disturbance in the servants' quarters. Something strange." Chapter 6. Secrets in the Attic. The disturbance in the servants' quarters turned out to be little more than a miscommunication. A broken china, cup, a spilled jar of preserves, and a frightened young maid who had imagined hearing footsteps in the hall. Still, the incident only served to add to the atmosphere of unease that hung over Elderwick Hall. Poirot, ever the sceptic, seemed unfazed by the commotion. Instead, he had focused his attention on something far more intriguing. The attic. From the moment he had stepped foot in the manor, his gaze had wandered to the shadowed space above the main hall, where the air was thick with dust and the sense of time standing still. Later that afternoon, after the séance had been dismissed, Poirot requested a tour of the attic. Lord Deverell was reluctant at first, but Poirot's persistence had a way of wearing people down. Soon enough, we found ourselves climbing narrow, creaking stairs toward the door to the attic. The door itself was small, unremarkable, easily overlooked. But as Poirot reached for the handle, I noticed the faintest hesitation in his movements. His eyes narrowed, and for a split second I could almost hear the soft hum of his thoughts. He was already drawing connections I could not yet see. Inside, the attic was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb. The shelves were lined with old trunks, piles of weathered books, and long-forgotten furniture covered in white sheets. Dust clung to every surface, and the air had a heavy, musty smell, as if the attic had not been disturbed for decades. Poirot moved with his usual grace, inspecting every object, every corner. His eyes flicked over the covered furniture, the forgotten objects of a household's past. But it was when he reached a small, inconspicuous trunk at the far corner of the room that I saw his interest piqued. "Mon ami," he said quietly, "this trunk, it is older than the rest." He knelt down beside it, his gloved hands running over the cracked leather surface. The trunk was locked, but Poirot's fingers danced across the metal clasps, probing gently. "It is not locked by mere chance," he muttered to himself before rising to his feet. He turned to me, his eyes sharp. "Look, Hastings, do you see?" I stepped forward and saw the faint, almost imperceptible marks on the trunk's surface. Scratches, not from years of neglect, but from something more deliberate. Someone had attempted to hide something within, or perhaps someone had been hiding in it. Poirot stood back, his gaze drifting over the room. A secret, hidden in plain sight. But what was inside? His voice carried an edge of excitement, a feeling of nearing an answer. I glanced at the room. The attic seemed empty enough, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something more lurked within its shadows. The trunk wasn't the only thing that seemed to hold a secret. Something about the room felt wrong, as if the past was hanging in, the air waiting to be uncovered. Poirot motioned toward the far wall. "Hastings, do you notice the bookshelves?" I turned to see the rows of dusty volumes, each bound in dark leather, yet one shelf stood out. It was newer, more organized, and more meticulously cared for than the others. Poirot's expression softened. "Perhaps this is where our ghost began." He moved quickly across the attic, pulling down a few books to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside there was a single small box. Poirot opened it with the careful touch of someone who knew the significance of each item he handled. Inside the box were several letters, each aged and yellowed with time, and a photograph of a young woman. The woman's face was familiar. It was Elsie Pharaoh, the missing maid. Her eyes were wide and fearful, her posture rigid, as though she were being forced to pose for the photograph. Poirot studied it carefully, his gaze never wavering. "This is no ghost," he said, almost to himself. Elsie Pharaoh was here, but she was not the frightened servant we were led to believe. He carefully laid the letters out on the table. They were addressed to someone named Martha Deverell, Lord Deverell's mother. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. Poirot turned to me, his voice steady. Elsie knew something. She learned something she was not meant to know. And now, I suspect, someone is trying to silence her, both in life and in death. Chapter 7. The Vicar's Slip of the Tongue. The discovery of Elsie Pharaoh's hidden letters cast a shadow over our investigation. The letters spoke of a secret, something deeply disturbing, that Elsie had discovered about the Deverell family. It was clear now that the young maid's disappearance had been no accident. But the question remained, what had she found? And why had someone gone to such lengths to keep it buried? Poirot's curiosity was insatiable, and the next step, he decided, was to visit the local vicar, Reverend Samuel Hargrove. The vicar had been a regular presence at Elderwick Hall, a quiet observer of the events surrounding the estate. If anyone knew the truth about the past, Poirot reasoned, it would be the vicar. The vicar's residence was a modest cottage at the edge of the village, a few miles from the estate. When we arrived, we were greeted by a man of average height, with a weathered face that seemed to carry the weight of many years. Reverend Hargrove had a gentle manner about him, but there was a weariness in his eyes, as though he had been keeping secrets of his own for far too long. "Monsieur Poirot, Dr. Hastings," he said with a slight bow, ushering us inside. "I've heard of your arrival, of course. Lord Deverell has spoken highly of you." We exchanged pleasantries, but Poirot wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. "Reverend Hargrove, we have come to ask about the Deverell family, specifically the disappearance of Elsie Pharaoh. Perhaps you can shed some light on what occurred." The vicar's face darkened slightly at the mention of Elsie's name. He glanced down at his hands, clasped together in front of him, as though he were considering his words carefully. Elsie. Yes, she was a good girl, never a troublemaker. But her disappearance, well, it has always troubled me, the vicar said softly. You see, there were whispers at the time, rumours of things that weren't right at the manor. I had always thought them to be the talk of idle minds, but now I wonder. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes intense. What kind of rumours? The vicar hesitated, clearly torn. But something in Poirot's calm, insistent manner seemed to put him at ease. He sighed, rubbing his brow as though trying to dispel a troubling thought. Rumours about Lord Deverell's late brother Robert, the vicar said quietly. It was said that Robert had an interest in Elsie, though no one could prove it. But there were certain actions that raised questions. Strange behaviour, disappearing for hours at a time. And then, when Elsie vanished, there was nothing but silence. No investigation, No inquiries. The family quickly moved to cover up the matter. I glanced at Poirot, sensing his thoughts were already moving in several directions at once. Family covered it up, Poirot repeated, his voice calm but probing. Yes, the vicar answered. There was a hush, a silence. Robert's death a few months later was attributed to natural causes, but I've always wondered. You see, there was no body found for Elsie, no trace. And yet everyone seemed to want to move on, as if nothing had happened. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And did you ever speak to anyone about these rumours? The vicar looked uncomfortable, his hands twisting in his lap. I may have mentioned it once or twice, but only in passing. I never wanted to stir the pot. The Deverells are a respected family, and I didn't think it was my place to interfere. Poirot studied the vicar for a moment, as if weighing his every word. But you have an idea, yes? About what happened to Elsie Pharaoh? Reverend Hargrove hesitated, then nodded slightly. There was a slip of the tongue one evening. A few weeks after Elsie disappeared. It was Lord Robert, actually. He was drunk, and he mumbled something about keeping the girl quiet. I never understood what he meant by it at the time, but now I wonder if he was involved in her disappearance, if he knew something that could not be spoken. Poirot's face remained impassive, but his eyes glinted with quiet satisfaction. Thank you, Reverend Hargrove. You have been most helpful. As we left the vicar's cottage, I could sense Poirot's mind working furiously. The slip of the tongue, the mention of keeping the girl quiet. It was becoming clear that someone had not only silenced Elsie Pharaoh, but had done so in a way that no one could trace. Mon ami, Poirot said, his voice low. The pieces are falling into place. It is no longer a question of whether Elsie knew something. She did. The question now is, who would go to such lengths to silence her? Chapter 8. The Guest Who Lied. The next morning, after a night spent in deep contemplation, Poirot requested that we meet with the guests who had been present at the séance the evening before. Each one had a potential role to play in the growing mystery surrounding Elsie Pharaoh's disappearance and the supposed ghost that haunted Elderwick Hall. One of them, Poirot was certain, was hiding something. Lord Deverell had made arrangements for us to meet the guests in the drawing-room. As we entered, Poirot's keen eyes scanned each individual. They sat in uneasy silence, as if they too were aware of the tensions that had been growing since our arrival. There was Miss Clarissa, Waverley, the young woman who had screamed during the séance. She sat now with a delicate, almost fragile air, her hands nervously twisting a handkerchief in her lap. The others were equally on edge. Mr. Gregory Shaw, a well-to-do businessman with a weathered face and sharp, calculating eyes. Lady Edith Holloway, a widow whose silence seemed to speak louder than words. And Dr. Jonathan Hargrove, the local physician and nephew of Reverend Hargrove. Poirot wasted no time. We have gathered you here, mes amis, because we believe one of you knows more about the events at Elderwick Hall than you are letting on. He began, his voice as sharp as ever. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Miss Waverley's eyes darted nervously toward the door, as though she might find an escape. Poirot's gaze lingered on her for a moment, before moving on. "Let us begin with you, Miss Waverley," Poirot said, his tone polite but insistent. "Last evening, during the séance, You saw the apparition of Elsie Pharaoh. But why, I ask, were you the only one to see her?" Miss Waverley blushed, her face flushing with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. I don't know," she stammered. I saw her. I was so sure. I know it sounds mad, but—" Poirot held up a hand, silencing her. "It is not madness I seek, mademoiselle. It is truth. Tell me, did you know Elsie Pharaoh? Had you ever met her before?" Miss Waverley hesitated, her fingers twitching in her lap. "No," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. I never knew her." Poirot's gaze was unwavering, and yet you were able to recognize her even in the dim light. How curious. Miss Waverley's eyes shifted nervously. I must have seen her portrait somewhere." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And you, Mr. Shaw?" he asked, turning to the businessman. "What do you know of Elsie Pharaoh?" Mr. Shaw stiffened. "Nothing," he replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I have no interest in the matter, Monsieur Poirot. It is a matter for the Deverils, not for me." Poirot studied him for a moment before moving on. "And Dr. Hargrove? Surely you, being a man of reason and logic, have something more to offer." Dr. Hargrove adjusted his glasses, his lips curling into a tight smile. "I know very little, I'm afraid. The young woman disappeared years ago, as you've been told. What else is there to discuss?" Poirot's expression remained unchanged. "That is exactly the problem, Doctor. Too many of you know too little, and yet each of you seems oddly invested in keeping certain things hidden." Lady Edith Holloway shifted in her chair, her expression unreadable. Poirot turned to her last. "And you, Lady Edith, you seem particularly quiet. What is it that you know about this ghost, this maid? I am sure you have heard the stories." Lady Edith met his gaze evenly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I have heard stories, yes," she said slowly, her voice smooth but tinged with something else, something guarded. "But I don't believe in ghosts. It's all nonsense." Poirot was not satisfied. "Then why did you attend the séance? Lady Edith? If you did not believe in ghosts, why would you subject yourself to such an experience?" Lady Edith hesitated, and for a brief moment Poirot saw the slightest flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but then, as if steeling herself, she lifted her chin. "I came because Lord Deveril invited me. I had no other reason." Poirot studied her for a long moment. "You lie, madam." The words hung in the air, as cold and sharp as a dagger. Lady Edith flinched, her posture stiffening, but she said nothing. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You are hiding something. I do not know what, but I suspect it has to do with Elsie Pharaoh. Perhaps you, like Miss Waverley, recognized the ghost. Perhaps you knew her in another way." The room was silent, and in that moment the truth seemed to hang just out of reach, as though the veil between the past and the present was being lifted. But no one spoke. Poirot stood up, his movements precise. "I shall find the truth, mes amis. You may not realize it yet, but you are all part of this story. The question is, who among you will reveal it first?" Chapter 9. The Footsteps That Came from Nowhere. The atmosphere in Elderwick Hall grew even more oppressive as the days passed. The mysterious events surrounding Elsie Pharaoh and the strange occurrences within the manor were beginning to wear on everyone. Poirot, however, seemed as unruffled as ever. his attention focused on the smallest of details that others would overlook. It was late one evening, just as the clock in the hall struck 10, that I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the crackling fire in the drawing-room. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again. The soft, rhythmic sound of footsteps, as though someone was walking down the corridor outside. I rose from my chair, glancing toward Poirot, who was sitting with his back to the door. His face remained impassive, but his fingers drummed lightly against the armrest of his chair, a subtle indication that he had already heard the sound as well. "The footsteps," I whispered, not quite believing my own words. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "Indeed, Hastings, footsteps that should not be there." I stood moving toward the door. Poirot rose with me, his gaze never leaving the spot where the footsteps had seemed to come from. We opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The air was cold, the old wood of the floorboards creaking beneath our feet. The house seemed to hold its breath, the silence almost too thick to bear. The footsteps continued, faint, measured, as if someone was walking with purpose, but no hurry. But when I turned the corner, the hallway was empty. There was no one in sight. Poirot's expression was unreadable as he surveyed the empty hallway. "Mon ami," he said quietly, "these footsteps are not the work of a ghost. They are the work of someone trying to remain unseen." I looked at him puzzled. "But no one is here, Poirot. How can anyone be making those sounds?" Poirot's lips curved into a slight smile, the kind he wore when he was on the verge of a discovery. "That, Hastings, is the question we must answer." We moved down the hallway, Poirot's every step calculated, deliberate. At the far end of the corridor, we found what we were looking for, a small door, tucked away in a corner, which led to a narrow staircase that descended into the depths of the manor. It was a door that, if you didn't know to look for it, would be easy to miss. Poirot bent down, examining the hinges. "This door is rarely used," he murmured. "In fact, I believe it has been purposely hidden. It leads to a passage that runs beneath the house." I stood beside him, astonished. A passage? And the footsteps? They were coming from here. Poirot gave a nod. "I believe so. The sounds of the footsteps were not from above us, but from below. Someone has been walking through these hidden corridors, moving about the house unseen." Without hesitation, Poirot turned the handle and pushed open the door. A cool draught swept out from the passage, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and age. Poirot stepped inside, motioning for me to follow. We moved down the narrow staircase, our footsteps muffled against the stone floor. The passage was dimly lit by a few faint flickering candles set along the walls, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to shift in the corners of our vision. "Who would use this passage?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the thick silence. Poirot's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of his certainty. "Someone who wishes to remain hidden, but still wishes to be close to the action. Someone who has been watching, listening, waiting." We continued down the passage, which twisted and turned as though it had been built to confuse anyone who might wander through it. Finally, we arrived at a small, unmarked door. Poirot paused, his fingers tracing the edges of the old wood. "This," he said, his voice low, is where our answers lie." He pushed the door open slowly, revealing a small hidden room filled with various discarded objects. Old trunks, crates of forgotten household items, and a few stacks of papers. But it was what was in the centre of the room that caught my attention. There, on a table, lay a set of photographs. Old, faded images of Elsie Pharaoh. She was standing in front of the manor, smiling brightly, but in each photograph there was something strange. A shadow lingering just behind her, barely visible in the dim light. Someone had been watching her, even in the moments when she had not known. Poirot stepped forward, picking up one of the photographs and turning it over. The back of the photo was marked with a name, Martha Deverill. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Martha Deverill, Lord Deverill's mother. Poirot nodded, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the photo. Yes, and I believe these photographs hold the key to Elsie's disappearance. But more than that, they reveal the truth behind the ghost that haunts this house. I turned to him, my mind racing. So the ghost was never a ghost at all. No, Poirot said, his voice firm. The ghost was a lie designed to conceal the truth. Elsie Pharaoh did not vanish into thin air. She was silenced, and those responsible have worked hard to ensure no one would ever uncover the truth. He looked back at the photographs, his expression hardening. But the truth, mon ami, will come to light, and when it does, it will expose more than one guilty party. Chapter 10. The False Apparition. The discovery of the photographs in the hidden room was a revelation, but it only deepened the mystery. The images of Elsie Pharaoh standing before Elderwick Hall, accompanied by the faint ghostly shadow lurking behind her, confirmed something Poirot had already suspected. The story of the haunted maid was not a supernatural occurrence, but a carefully orchestrated charade. Someone had been playing a dangerous game, using fear and deceit to conceal a truth far darker than anyone in the house could imagine. We returned to the drawing room, where the remaining guests awaited our next move. The fire in the hearth crackled with a soft, unsettling noise as the shadows in the room grew longer, stretching out across the walls. Poirot stood by the window, his profile illuminated by the flickering light, deep in thought. I couldn't help but notice how his usual calm demeanour had sharpened over the past few days. He was no longer simply solving a mystery. He was hunting down a carefully constructed web of lies, and the hunt was nearing its end. I stood beside him, watching the gathering below, and Poirot turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "Mon ami, it is time. We must confront them all." I nodded, understanding his meaning. The time for secrets was over. The moment had arrived for Poirot to expose the carefully concealed truth. We made our way down to the drawing-room, where Lord Deverill and the guests sat in uncomfortable silence. Miss Waverley, Mr. Shaw, Lady Edith, and Dr. Hargrove. All of them had their eyes fixed on the floor, seemingly unwilling to meet Poirot's gaze. But they could not avoid his scrutiny. None of them could. Poirot stepped into the centre of the room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone present. His voice was low, but it carried a force that no one could ignore. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, "we have come to the end of our investigation. The pieces of the puzzle are now laid out before us, and the truth is clear. Elsie Pharaoh did not die in the manner we were led to believe. She did not disappear into thin air. No, she was silenced. Silenced by someone here in this very room. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but none spoke. Poirot's eyes swept over each of them, his gaze lingering on Miss Waverley, who shrank back slightly. "Miss Waverley," Poirot said, his voice sharp, "you are not as innocent as you pretend to be. You recognized Elsie Pharaoh in the photographs, not because you saw her once in a portrait, but because you knew her. You were her friend, and you knew exactly what she had uncovered." Miss Waverley's eyes widened, and she looked like she might say something, but the words caught in her throat. Poirot continued, unrelenting. "You knew about the secrets she had uncovered in this house, secrets that some would go to any length to keep hidden, secrets about Robert Deverill and his obsession with Elsie. And when Elsie found out something she shouldn't have, you were the one who helped make her disappear." A tense silence fell over the room. Miss Waverley finally opened her mouth to speak, but Poirot raised a hand to stop her. "No, mademoiselle," Poirot said quietly. "It is too late for explanations. The truth has been exposed." At that moment, Lady Edith Holloway rose to her feet, her face pale and strained. "This is absurd! You can't accuse me like this, Poirot. I have nothing to do with it." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he turned to face her. "But you do, Lady Edith. You knew more about Elsie's disappearance than you admitted. You were not just a passive observer. You were a participant in the deception." She recoiled at his words, but Poirot pressed on. "You played your part in the ghostly charade, in spreading the rumours about Elsie's return. You may have thought it was harmless, but you were complicit in creating fear, fear that kept the truth buried." Lady Edith's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Poirot turned to Dr. Hargrove. "And you, Doctor, knew about the affair between Robert and Elsie. You knew what had happened between them, but you kept silent. You were not just a man of medicine. You were a man of secrets, bound by loyalty to the Deverills." Dr. Hargrove's face tightened, but he said nothing. Finally, Poirot turned to Lord Deverill, whose face had gone ashen. "And you, my lord, were the one who orchestrated the entire ruse. You were the one who wanted Elsie silenced, not just for what she had learned, but because of what she could have revealed about your late brother's behaviour, your guilt, your fear of being exposed. This was the real ghost that haunted Elderwick Hall." Lord Deverill stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. "You know nothing," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I did what I had to do to protect my family. You have no idea what we were dealing with." Poirot's expression softened, but his words were no less firm. "I know more than you think, Lord Deverill. I know that the ghost you feared was not a spectre, but a memory of the crime you wanted to forget. But some memories, monsieur, cannot be buried so easily." A long silence followed. The weight of Poirot's words hung heavy in the air, each guest processing the revelation in their own way. Poirot's voice broke the silence once more. "You have all played your part in this deception, but the truth has a way of coming to light. And when it does, it exposes the lies we tell ourselves to sleep at night." Chapter 11. The Crime Buried in Silence. The tension in the room was unbearable. Poirot's words had cut through the facade, exposing the carefully guarded secrets of Elderwick Hall. The guests, once so sure of their innocence, now sat in stunned silence, trapped under the weight of their own lies. Poirot moved across the room, his footsteps measured and deliberate, as though he were walking through a minefield of guilt and deception. Each of the guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes avoiding his, as though trying to escape the piercing gaze that seemed to see through them. "I told you, Hastings," Poirot said quietly, turning to me. "The ghost of Elsie Pharaoh was never a ghost at all. It was a story, a carefully crafted lie to keep the truth buried. But now the truth is no longer something to hide. It is something that must be faced." I nodded, still grappling with the enormity of the revelation. The tragic story of Elsie's disappearance had been twisted and manipulated into something far darker. What had begun as a haunting had turned into a carefully orchestrated cover-up, one that had lasted for decades. Lord Deverell, who had been standing in the far corner of the room, his hands shaking at his sides, finally spoke. "You think you've solved it, Poirot," he said, his voice hoarse. "But you don't understand. You don't know what we were protecting. Elsie found out about Robert. She knew about what happened, about how he—" His voice faltered, and he looked away, unable to finish the sentence. Poirot's expression was unreadable, but his voice was soft, almost gentle. What did happen? Lord Deverell? What was it that Elsie uncovered that was so dangerous? Lord Deverell hesitated, his face twisted in anguish. "Robert, my brother, he was obsessed with Elsie. It went beyond a simple attraction. He hurt her. He made her believe that he could give her a future. But it was all a lie. And when she found out the truth, when she realized what he had done—" Poirot's eyes never wavered. "You killed her to keep your brother's secret hidden, did you not?" Lord Deverell's shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked like a man who had run out of lies. "Yes," he whispered. "We couldn't let her expose him. Robert was dead already, but the scandal would have destroyed us. It would have destroyed everything." Poirot's gaze softened, but his voice was steady. "And so you made sure Elsie disappeared, erased her from the records. You buried the truth." A long, heavy silence followed. The weight of Lord Deverell's confession seemed to hang in the air, suffocating the room. It was clear that this was not the ending Poirot had expected. The investigation had uncovered more than just a murder. It had uncovered a deep, hidden trauma, one that had haunted the Deverell family for years. Poirot turned to the others, his gaze now moving from guest to guest. "Each of you played your part in this cover-up. Miss Waverley, you recognized Elsie because you were her friend. You knew what she had uncovered, and you helped conceal the truth. Lady Edith, you were complicit in spreading the rumours, encouraging the ghost story. Dr. Hargrove, you kept quiet, perhaps out of loyalty to your family, perhaps because you knew too much." Each of the guests shifted under Poirot's scrutiny. They knew, deep down, that they could no longer hide. The weight of their collective guilt was too much to bear. Poirot paused, his gaze lingering on the photograph of Elsie Pharaoh, the one that had started it all. "You believed that by silencing her you would protect your family. But in the end, It was your own silence that has done the most damage." Lord Deverell's face was pale, his hands trembling. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this. But once we started hiding the truth, there was no going back." Poirot's voice was quiet, but it carried the finality of a verdict. "The truth always finds a way to come to light, my friend. No matter how deep you bury it, it will always rise again. It is a force stronger than any ghost." As Poirot turned to leave, I could see the subtle shift in the room. The ghost that had haunted Elderwick Hall was no longer a spectre in the night, but a shadow cast by the dark secrets of those who had tried to bury the past. The truth had finally come to light, but it had come at a great cost. Poirot paused at the door and turned to me. "Hastings, the case is closed. But let this be a reminder. Some ghosts are born from the lies we tell ourselves, and the truth, no matter how painful, will always find a way to speak." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving behind a room full of guilt and revelations. The hall, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now stood empty, its ghosts laid to rest. Chapter 12. The Ghost Who Knew. Too much, the house had fallen silent. The heavy weight of truth hung over Elderwick Hall like a dark cloud, and the once terrifying ghost of Elsie Pharaoh, who had haunted the manor with whispers and footsteps, was finally laid to rest. What had seemed like a supernatural mystery had, in the end, been a story of deceit, guilt, and the lengths to which some will go to protect their darkest secrets. As Poirot and I stood on the steps of the manor, watching the sun rise over the horizon, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. The truth had been revealed, but what did that really mean for those who had been involved in this tangled web of lies? Lord Deverell was left to face the consequences of his actions, though it was clear that he was a broken man. The others, Miss Waverley, Lady Edith, and Dr. Hargrove, would also have to reckon with their roles in the cover-up, though I doubted any of them would ever find peace. The past had caught up with them, and in the end they had all played their parts in keeping a painful truth buried. Poirot, as always, seemed unfazed by the drama that had unfolded. His face remained impassive, though I could see the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He had solved the case, and justice would be served, even if the price had been high. "Mon ami," he said quietly, turning to me, "the truth, while it may set us free, does not always bring peace. The Deverell family will be forever marked by this, and their guilt will linger long after we leave." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. The truth had exposed a tragedy, but it had also freed the manor from its chains. The ghost, the haunting, had all been born from guilt, a secret that had festered for too long. "The ghost who knew too much," Poirot murmured, his voice thoughtful, "was not Elsie Pharaoh. It was the truth itself. It is always the truth that haunts us the most, Hastings. Not the dead, but the things we wish to forget." I glanced back at the manor, now bathed in the light of the early morning. The ghosts of the past would never truly be gone, not for Lord Deverell, not for anyone involved in this dark tale. But at least for now, the story was over. The truth had won. Poirot turned to leave, his steps purposeful. "There are other mysteries waiting for us, Hastings. But remember this one. The dead may be forgotten, but the living can never escape the consequences of their actions." I followed him down the path, the first rays of sunlight casting long shadows over the land. The mystery of Elderwick Hall had been solved, but the lessons it taught would linger, like the ghosts that haunted us all.